On a rainy night, all seemed lost for Ethan Carter, until he encountered something unexpected on the road. An unlikely encounter, an unexpected decision, and a journey that will change not only his life, but that of many others. Curious to know how? Let's discover this fascinating story together. The rain pelted the armored windows of the Mercedes as Ethan Carter drove along the winding road that led to his mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. His fingers drummed on the Italian leather steering wheel, following not a song. The radio was off, as usual, but the restless rhythm of his thoughts. The digital clock read 11:47 p.m. Too late for any decent person to be on the road. But decent wasn't a word Ethan associated with himself anymore, not after the last 18 months. The mansion loomed ahead, an imposing three-story building that looked more like a fortress than a home. The automatic garden lights came on as they approached, illuminating the meticulously pruned bushes and the central fountain, now silent due to the storm. There were no other lights on. There was no one waiting for him. That's when the headlights caught something on the side of the road, a quick, almost imperceptible movement. Ethan instinctively slowed down, years of corporate paranoia making him scan the shadows for threats. What he saw, however, was far from threatening. A dog, no bigger than a border collie, was shivering in the pouring rain. Its fur, which appeared to be a mixture of brown and white under all the water, was completely soaked. The animal looked straight into the headlights, and Ethan noticed something in its eyes, not fear, but a kind of weary resignation that he recognized immediately. "Not my problem," he muttered to himself, accelerating slightly. The dog continued to stand still, trembling. Ethan passed him, watching through the rearview mirror as the animal slowed down to just a dark dot in the storm. He reached the main gate, entered the security code and waited for the heavy iron structures to open. The rain continued mercilessly. His mind went back to the dog. How long would he survive in this storm? Temperatures were plummeting, and the forecast predicted the coldest night of the fall. Damn it, he cursed, hitting the steering wheel. 18 months ago, he wouldn't have hesitated. He would have driven straight to his empty house, poured himself a $12,000 bottle of bourbon, and slept on the abandoned animal without a second thought. But 18 months ago, he was still married to Rebecca. 18 months ago, he still trusted David as his best friend and business partner. 18 months ago, he still believed he had built something real. The Mercedes turned the corner with a squeal of tires on the wet road. The dog was still there, but now it was lying down, as if it had given up looking for shelter. Ethan stopped the car and rolled down his window, feeling the cold rain splashing on his face. "Hey," he called, not knowing exactly what to call a street dog. The animal raised its head, its eyes reflecting the light of the headlights. "Come here." The dog didn't move. Of course not, why would you trust a stranger? Ethan knew that logic well. With a heavy sigh, he unlocked the doors and stepped out into the storm, his $8,000 Italian suit instantly soaking through. "You're going to make me catch you, aren't you?" he muttered, approaching slowly. The dog watched, still trembling, but didn't run away. When Ethan got close enough, he noticed that the animal was limping slightly on its hind leg. Hesitantly, he held out his hand. The dog sniffed his fingers and, to his surprise, licked them gently. There was no collar, just a matted coat and a few small visible wounds. "Okay, let's do this," Ethan muttered, crouching down. Carefully, he wrapped the animal in his arms. The dog didn't resist, on the contrary, it seemed to relax against his chest, as if it knew this was its last chance. Back in the car, Ethan observed the animal shivering on the passenger seat, leaving a puddle of water on the Italian leather. 18 months ago, this would have infuriated him. Now, looking at that abandoned and wounded creature, he felt something different, something he hadn't felt for a long time. "Just for tonight," he said aloud, more to himself than to his new passenger. "Tomorrow we'll look for its owner or a shelter." The dog turned its head towards him, and for a moment Ethan could have sworn he saw a gleam of amusement in those brown eyes, as if the animal knew something he didn't. As if, somehow, that animal knew something he didn't. As if, somehow, that night was more than just a rescue in the storm. When he finally walked through the gates of his property, Ethan Carter didn't realize that he had just made the decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of dozens of other people. All he knew was that, for the first time in 18 months, he wasn't returning to a completely empty house. The first thing Ethan Carter noticed when he woke up was the silence. The same silence that had haunted him for 18 months, ever since the halls of the mansion became too empty for a single person. For a moment, the events of the night before seemed like just a strange dream, until he heard the distinctive sound of claws scratching the marble floor of the hallway. "Shit," he muttered, sitting up in the king-size bed. The digital clock read 6:13, almost an hour later than his usual wake-up time. For the first time in over a year, he had missed his rigorously timed morning routine. When he opened his bedroom door, he saw a trail of mud winding down the corridor. The dog, which he still refused to name, had apparently discovered the back garden through the kitchen door that Augustine, his housekeeper, left open in the mornings to ventilate the house. He followed the traces to the kitchen, where he found the animal sitting behaving itself next to its makeshift water bowl, a Chinese porcelain bowl from the Ming dynasty that cost more than some popular cars. The dog stared at him with the same intelligent eyes as the night before, wagging its tail slightly at the sight of him. "Do you have any idea how much this floor costs?" Ethan asked, pointing to the paw marks that stained the Italian marble. The dog tilted his head, as if considering the question. "And that bowl is probably worth more than an animal shelter's entire annual budget." The words came out automatically, echoing the man he was before, the one who measured everything in dollars and cents. But something about the way the animal looked at him made his irritation wilt. The dog didn't care about the value of marble or porcelain. He just wanted water, and he found a way to get it. "Mr. Carter?" Augustine's voice surprised him. The housekeeper was standing in the kitchen doorway, her eyes fixed on the dog. In 15 years of working for him, it was the first time Ethan had seen her genuinely surprised. "I didn't know we'd have a new resident." "We won't," Ethan replied quickly. "It's temporary. I found him in the storm last night. As soon as the vet opens, I'll take him to check for a microchip." Augustine nodded, but Ethan noticed a small smile forming on her lips. "Of course, sir. Shall I prepare your usual breakfast?" "Yes," and, he hesitated, looking at the dog. "Do we have anything he can eat?" "I can prepare some eggs and extra bacon," she offered, already moving around the kitchen with her characteristic efficiency. "And maybe call Pet Palace to deliver some basic supplies." "That won't be necessary," Ethan insisted, but Augustine was already on the phone, placing the order as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. As he sipped his coffee, poached eggs, wholemeal toast and premium Hawaiian coffee, Ethan watched the dog devour his own meal. There was something hypnotic about the way the animal savored each mouthful, as if it were the best meal of his life. "You need a name," he muttered, surprising himself. "I can't keep calling you dog." The animal raised its head, its ears moving forward with interest. "How about?" Ethan stopped, realizing the absurdity of the situation. He was about to name a dog that wasn't even his, using his cup of artisan coffee as an excuse to procrastinate the inevitable call to the vet. The phone in his pocket vibrated, a message from his assistant reminding him of the board meeting at 9 a.m. The reality of the outside world threatened to intrude on this strange, surreal moment in the kitchen. "Lucky," he finally said, and the dog immediately turned its head in his direction. "Because you were lucky that I passed that road yesterday." The animal, Lucky, wagged his tail more enthusiastically. "Mr. Carter," Augustine called from the doorway, holding up the cordless phone. "The Pet Palace is asking if they should include a bed in the order." "No," Ethan answered automatically. Then he looked at Lucky, who had come over and leaned his head on his knee, staining his Italian linen pants with traces of bacon. "Yes," he corrected himself, "and a collar." "Temporarily." When Augustine left, Ethan realized that he had been stroking Lucky's head without even noticing. The fur, now dry and brushed by the housekeeper's care earlier, revealed a unique pattern of brown and white. 18 months ago, the idea of a dirty dog in his immaculate kitchen, eating off his collector's china, would have been unthinkable. But 18 months ago, he still believed he knew what was important in life. Temporarily, he repeated to Lucky, who just kept looking at him with that expression that seemed to say he knew more than he let on. Just until we find its owner or a good shelter. His phone vibrated again, another reminder of the meeting. Ethan sighed, getting up to prepare for another day at the office. But for the first time in a long time, the thought of going home didn't seem so lonely. At the kitchen door, he turned one last time. Lucky had settled down by the window, the morning sun creating a golden halo around him. For a moment, Ethan had the strange feeling that it wasn't him who was rescuing the dog, but perhaps it was the other way around. Nonsense, he muttered to himself, adjusting his Hermes tie. He had a company to run, after all. He couldn't afford to philosophize about coincidences and lost dogs. But as he drove to the office, he couldn't stop thinking about Lucky, alone in that oversized house. And for the first time in 18 months, the silence in his life began to feel less like a refuge and more like a prison of his own making. The waiting room at the Oak Valley Veterinary Clinic was a study in contrasts. Sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, Ethan Carter, in his tailored Brioni suit, was completely out of place. Lucky was lying at his feet, surprisingly calm for a dog in a veterinary clinic. Lucky Carter, called out a veterinary assistant, consulting her clipboard. Ethan frowned as he heard the improvised surname. He didn't remember giving it on the registration form. Dr. Alexandra Bennett was younger than Ethan had expected, with keen eyes behind her thin-framed glasses. "So, this is Lucky," she smiled, stroking the head of the dog who, to Ethan's surprise, had voluntarily climbed onto the examination table. "You said you found him 3 days ago." "On Monday night, during the storm," Ethan confirmed, unconsciously checking his Patek Philippe. It was 10:23, and he had already cancelled 2 important meetings that morning. David, his ex-partner, would probably use this against him at the next board meeting. "He's in great shape for a dog that was on the street," commented Dr. Bennett, examining Lucky methodically. "Well-nourished, clean teeth, someone looked after him until recently." She picked up a small electronic device. "Let's check for a microchip." Ethan felt an unexpected twinge of apprehension. Over the last 3 days, Lucky had become a constant presence in his previously solitary routine. In the morning, the dog would accompany him on his run, something Ethan had abandoned months ago. In the evenings, he would lie quietly at his feet while he worked in his home office, offering a companionship that required nothing more than the occasional distracted cuddle. The scanner beeped sharply. "Ah, we've got something here," the vet smiled, jotting down a string of numbers. "I'll check the database." While they waited, Ethan watched Lucky, who kept his eyes fixed on him. "You knew about this all along, didn't you?" he muttered. "I knew it was temporary." The dog tilted his head, as he always did when Ethan spoke to him. Dr. Bennett returned with a curious expression. "Well, we found the record," she said, consulting her screen. "Lucky, and yes, that really is his name, belonged to a gentleman called George Winters." "But," she hesitated. "But? Mr. Winters passed away about a month ago. Terminal cancer." She adjusted her glasses, reading more information. "He was well known in the community. He ran the Hope Shelter downtown, a place that offers support to homeless people." Something in Lucky's expression changed, an almost human sadness that made Ethan's heart squeeze. What happened to Lucky after his owner passed away? According to the records, he stayed at the shelter for a few weeks, but disappeared 10 days ago. The vet smiled gently. "Dogs are incredibly intuitive. Sometimes they choose their own families." Ethan snorted. "We're not family. I just found him by chance." Chance? Dr. Bennett arched an eyebrow. Mr. Carter, in 15 years in the profession, I've learned that few encounters between humans and animals are truly accidental. She paused, observing the interaction between the two. Lucky is a retired guide dog. He was trained to help people, especially those who have lost their way. I haven't lost my way, Ethan protested automatically, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. The vet just smiled, handing him a folder. Here's all his medical documentation. And, she hesitated again, there's also an envelope that Mr. Winters left in case Lucky was found. With slightly trembling fingers, Ethan opened the yellowed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a faded photograph showing an elderly man smiling next to Lucky, both surrounded by people who clearly lived on the streets, but smiled as if they were at home. To anyone who finds Lucky, if you're reading this, it means my time is up, but Lucky has found you. I don't believe in coincidences. Lucky has a gift for finding people who need him as much as he needs them. For 20 years, I've run the Hope Shelter, and Lucky has been my partner for the last 8. He's not just a dog, he's a guardian of lost souls. Each person he brought to us had a story of loss, loneliness, or pain, but also had the potential for healing and renewal. I just ask you to consider, maybe it wasn't you who rescued Lucky. Maybe it was he who found you. With hope, George Winters. Ethan folded the letter slowly, feeling the weight of the words. Lucky rested his head on his knee, his brown eyes full of that quiet wisdom Ethan had noticed on the night of the storm. The Hope Shelter, he murmured, absent-mindedly stroking Lucky's ears. Is that where you were trying to get to that night? The shelter has been struggling since George passed away, Dr. Bennett commented. It was in the papers last week. They need $300,000 by the end of the month or they'll have to close. $300,000. A sum that, 18 months ago, Ethan would have spent without a second thought on a new car or a work of art. Now, looking at Lucky, at the photo, at the heartfelt letter from a man who has dedicated his life to helping others, that amount seemed both insignificant and monumental. His phone vibrated, another missed meeting, another opportunity for David to question his dedication to the company. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized that perhaps there were more important things than financial statements and quarterly reports. Come on, Lucky, he said, getting up, I think we need to pay a visit to the city center. As they walked to the car, Ethan couldn't help noticing that Lucky looked different, more determined, as if he knew exactly where they were going. And maybe he did. After all, as George had written, perhaps there were no coincidences. 18 months of bitterness and isolation had built walls around Ethan Carter. But now, thanks to a stray dog on a stormy night, those walls were beginning to show their first cracks. The Hope Shelter looked nothing like what Ethan had imagined. Located in an old warehouse in Hartford's industrial area, the 3-story building had a worn facade, with exposed bricks and fogged windows. But there was something else there, little signs of life and care, pots of flowers in the first-floor windows, a colorful mural painted on one of the side walls, and a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Welcome Home." Lucky got out of the Mercedes before Ethan could even fully open the door, his tail wagging with an energy he hadn't yet shown. A few people on the sidewalk stopped to observe the unusual scene, an apparently abandoned dog jumping out of a car that cost more than many houses. Lucky? A female voice sounded from the entrance to the shelter. My God, it's really you. A woman in her 30s hurried down the worn steps of the entrance. Her red hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she was wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt with the shelter's logo. Lucky ran up to her, jumping and barking happily. Where have you been, you old rascal? She asked, kneeling down to hug the dog. Then her eyes met Ethan's, and her expression changed instantly. And you are? Ethan Carter, he replied, feeling strangely out of place in his Italian suit. I met Lucky during the storm on Monday. Clara Morgan, she introduced herself, standing up and wiping her hands on her jeans. Her gaze assessed him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I'm the director of the shelter. Or what's left of it. Before Ethan could reply, a commotion broke out at the entrance to the building. Several people, homeless people, volunteers, staff, started coming out, all calling for Lucky. The dog ran from person to person, receiving caresses and giving out licks, like a local celebrity returning home. He was the mascot of the place, Clara explained, watching the scene with a sad smile. After he left, Lucky was devastated. One day he just disappeared. Dr. Bennett told me about George, Ethan said. And about the situation at the shelter. Clara's smile disappeared. So you know we have until the end of the month before the banks take over the building. She let out a bitter laugh. $300,000. For some, that's the price of a luxury car. For us, it's the difference between hope and despair for 50 people. Ethan watched the movement around the shelter. An older man in a worn military jacket was helping a young mother with her baby up the steps. Two teenagers carried boxes of donations. A man in a wheelchair chatted animatedly with a volunteer. George built this from scratch, Clara continued. 20 years dedicated to giving a second chance to people that society prefers to ignore. And now, she gestured towards the building, it could all come to an end because some executives in their glass towers decide that the land is worth more than the lives we've saved here. Lucky turned back to them, sitting between the two of them as if mediating an important conversation. Ethan noticed that, despite the visible wear and tear on the building in the precarious situation, there was a dignity to the place, the same dignity he saw in Clara's eyes. "Miss Morgan," he began, but was interrupted by a shout from the entrance. "Clara!" A young volunteer ran towards him, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "The bank called. They've brought forward the deadline. They say we have to present the money by next Friday or they'll start the eviction process." Clara's face paled, but her posture remained firm. "Right. I'll call our regular donors again. Maybe if we explain the urgency. I can help," Ethan heard himself say, surprising himself as much as Clara. She looked at him skeptically. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate the offer, but we've seen this before. Rich executives show up, make grandiose promises, take a few photos for their social responsibility publicity and then disappear." "That's not it," Ethan protested, but was interrupted by a noise coming from the building. A small crowd was forming at the entrance, residents of the shelter who had heard about the bank's new deadline. "I'm sorry," Clara said, already turning to deal with the situation. "But if you've come here to feel better about your privileges, you've come to the wrong place. We have real work to do." She walked away, leaving Ethan standing on the sidewalk with Lucky. The dog looked at him with that expression he now knew well, the same one he had on the night of the storm, as if waiting to see what choice he would make. 18 months ago, Ethan would have turned around, got into his luxury car and left everyone else's problems behind. But something had changed. Maybe it was George's letter, or Clara's determined eyes, or the way Lucky seemed at home among those people society had forgotten. His phone vibrated, another meeting reminder, another urgent email from David about board decisions. Ethan looked at the handset, then at the shelter, and finally at Lucky. "Hey," he called, making Clara turn around. "Can I take a look at the shelter's accounting books?" Clara frowned. "Why?" "Because before I was an executive in a glass tower, I was an accountant who grew up in a housing project in the Bronx," Ethan replied, surprising himself with his own honesty. "And because maybe I can do more than just sign a check." For a moment, Clara just studied him, as if trying to see past the expensive suit and the successful facade. Finally, she nodded slightly. "The office is on the second floor," she said. "But be warned, we don't have imported coffee or air conditioning." Ethan smiled, loosening his silk tie. "That's okay. I've been through worse." As he followed Clara into the shelter, with Lucky trotting happily between them, Ethan realized that he was about to dive into something much bigger than a simple charity donation. And for the first time in a long time, the idea of getting involved, of really caring about something beyond himself, didn't seem so daunting. Clara's office on the second floor of the Hope Shelter was a testament to dedication and scarce resources. Organized piles of documents occupied every available surface, and a computer that looked at least 10 years old hummed noisily on a worn desk. But what caught Ethan's eye were the photographs on the walls, dozens of them, each telling a story of transformation. Each picture represents someone who has passed through here and managed to start again, Clara explained, noticing his interest. She pointed to one in particular, a smiling man wearing a chef's uniform. This is Marcus. He arrived here 3 years ago, addicted and hopeless. Today he's sous chef at one of the best restaurants in town. Ethan looked at the other photographs while Clara searched for the financial documents. In each one, he recognized the same sparkle in people's eyes, the sparkle of someone who has found a second chance. In several of them, Lucky appeared alongside George Winters, both silent witnesses to these transformations. Here's everything, Clara said, placing a cardboard box on the table. 5 years of financial records. George was dedicated, but accounting wasn't exactly his strong suit. Ethan began examining the documents, quickly realizing the magnitude of the problem. The shelter operated on minimal margins, relying mainly on donations and a few small government contracts. But there was something strange about the figures for the last few months. These bank fees, he muttered, frowning at a spreadsheet. They've tripled in the last 6 months. That's not right. The bank says it's because of the increased risk, Clara replied, taking a seat on the edge of the table. But honestly, I think they're trying to force us to close. This land is worth a fortune now that they're revitalizing the neighborhood. Lucky, who had settled down at Ethan's feet, suddenly raised his head. Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway, and soon an urgent knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Clara? A tall man in a worn military jacket, the same one Ethan had noticed earlier, was standing in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but Lauren's having another panic attack. Clara stood up immediately. Ethan, give me a few minutes. Lauren is one of our newest residents. She's... Go on, Ethan nodded, surprising himself with his own understanding. I'll keep going over it here. After Clara left, Ethan continued examining the documents, but his attention was caught by voices coming from the corridor. He approached the ajar door, observing a scene that made him stop. Clara was kneeling next to a young woman who must have been no more than 25. Lauren was shaking violently, hugging a sleeping baby to her chest. They're going to throw us out, she sobbed. How am I going to protect Emma? I can't go back to him, I can't. Lauren, look at me, Clara's voice was firm but gentle. As long as I'm here, you and Emma are safe. I promise. The veteran, who Ethan now realized was one of the shelter staff, put a comforting hand on Lauren's shoulder. No one's going to hurt you here, girl. We're a family. Family. The word echoed in Ethan's mind. 18 months ago, he believed that family meant blood ties and social obligations. Now, watching that scene, he was beginning to understand a very different meaning. He returned to the office, more determined than ever. Lucky followed him, taking a seat next to him as he dived back into the numbers. That's when he noticed something in the older contracts. The land, he muttered, pulling out a yellowed document. The land was donated to the original foundation of the shelter with a specific clause. His eyes ran over the legal text. It cannot be sold or used for commercial purposes for 50 years after the donation. Clara returned to the office, looking exhausted. Lauren is better now. She fled an abusive relationship 3 weeks ago. The shelter is the only safe place she knows. Clara, Ethan said, lifting the document. The bank can't legally force the sale of the land. This clause still has 12 years to run. She took the paper, her eyes widening as she read. But why are they pressuring us then? Because they're counting on our ignorance, Ethan replied, feeling a familiar indignation rise up, the same one he felt when he discovered David's betrayal. They probably have an interested buyer and are trying to force an illegal eviction. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted them again. This time, it was a man in a cheap suit carrying a briefcase. "Ms. Morgan? I'm from the bank. I've come to discuss the final terms of the..." He stopped when he saw Ethan, his face paling visibly. "Mr. Carter? I didn't expect to find you here." "Nathan Willis." Ethan stood up slowly. "Still working for Continental Bank? That's interesting. Especially considering your boss is on my board of directors." The man swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. "That's just a standard collection procedure." "An illegal billing procedure," Ethan corrected, his voice taking on the sharp tone he usually used in hostile negotiations. "And something tells me your boss would be very interested to know how you're trying to get around a legally binding donation clause." Willis took a step back. "I need to make some calls." "You do that," Ethan smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. "And tell your boss that Ethan Carter sent his regards." After the banker left hurriedly, Clara looked at Ethan with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You know these people?" "I know enough to know how they operate," he replied, turning his attention back to the documents. "The shelter still has serious financial problems, but at least we've bought ourselves some time to sort it out properly." Clara moved closer, studying his face. "Why are you doing this? Really doing this, not just signing a check?" Ethan looked at Lucky, who had approached Lauren and her baby in the hallway, providing the kind of comfort that only an animal can offer. "Let's just say someone reminded me recently that there's more to life than financial statements and quarterly reports." A small smile appeared on Clara's lips. "George used to say that sometimes we need to lose ourselves completely to find our true path. And sometimes," Ethan added, watching Lucky with the baby, "we need a guide to show us the way." The news that Ethan Carter was involved with a homeless shelter spread quickly through Connecticut's corporate circles. In his penthouse in Hartford's financial district, David Reynolds watched the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, a calculated smile on his face as he held up a recent photo of Ethan leaving the Hope Shelter. In the shelter itself, oblivious to the machinations of his former best friend, Ethan was sitting in the makeshift cafeteria, sharing a surprisingly good coffee with Clara. A week had passed since the confrontation with the bank, and things were beginning to take shape. "So you actually grew up in a housing project?" Clara asked, blowing the surface of her coffee. "I thought you were just trying to impress me." Ethan smiled, watching Lucky, who was resting next to one of the tables where Lauren was feeding her daughter. "Bronx River houses. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep me in school. I studied accounting using books borrowed from the public library." "What's changed?" Clara's question was soft, without judgment. Ethan was silent for a moment, long-suppressed memories returning to the surface. "I met David at college. I was there on a full scholarship. He came from a wealthy family, he had connections. He showed me a world where money opened all the doors." He paused, swirling his cup. "At some point, I forgot where I came from." "And then he cheated on you," Clara added. "It wasn't a question. He and Rebecca, my ex-wife. They'd been having an affair for months. By the time I found out, David had already persuaded part of the board to try to get me out of the company we'd built together." The bitter taste of memory was still there, but somehow it seemed less potent in the simple atmosphere of the cafeteria. Clara was about to reply when her phone rang. Her expression changed when she saw the number. "It's the bank again." "Answer it on speakerphone," Ethan suggested. The bank manager's voice sounded artificial through the speaker. "Ms. Morgan, in light of recent developments and interventions, the bank is willing to renegotiate the terms of the loan. Of course, we will still need substantial guarantees." "The guarantees are in the endowment clause that you conveniently ignored," Ethan interrupted, his voice taking on the sharp tone of boardroom days. And I believe the Department of Banking Regulation would be very interested to know how you manipulated the risk rates. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Carter, perhaps we could discuss this in a more professional setting? Sure. How about tomorrow, 10 a.m., at the Attorney General's office? I'm sure he'd love to hear about your predatory practices with charities. The phone was muted for a few seconds before the manager returned, his voice noticeably less confident. Maybe, we can find a more amicable solution. I'll send you a new proposal later today. After hanging up, Clara looked at Ethan with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Do you really know the Attorney General? No, he admitted with a small smile. But they don't know that. A movement at the entrance to the cafeteria caught his eye. The veteran, who Ethan now knew was called Frank, hurried in. Clara, there's someone outside who wants to talk to Mr. Carter. He says it's important. Ethan felt a twinge of apprehension. Few knew that he was involved with the shelter. When he reached the entrance, he understood the reason for his unease. Rebecca was standing on the sidewalk, impeccable in her Channel ensemble, looking strangely out of place against the backdrop of the worn-out building. Lucky, who had followed Ethan, emitted a low growl, something he had never done before. Ethan, she smiled, that smile that had once bewitched him. We need to talk. We have nothing to talk about, Rebecca. It's about David, she continued, ignoring his coldness. He's planning something. He's going to use his involvement with this, she looked around disdainfully, establishment to question your ability to lead the council. Why are you telling me this? Rebecca stepped forward, her expensive perfume contrasting with the simple air of the place. Because I regret it, Ethan. For what we did to you. David, he's not who I thought he was. 18 months ago, those words would have meant everything to Ethan. Now, looking at his ex-wife, he only felt a kind of distant pity. Rebecca, he said softly, you're not here because you regret it. You're here because David did to you what he did to me. She recoiled as if she had been slapped, her mask of control wavering momentarily. You don't understand. He's going to destroy you, Ethan. He's already spreading rumors about your mental health, suggesting that you're having a post-traumatic breakdown. Let him try, Ethan replied, surprising himself with his calm. Lucky moved closer, leaning against his leg in a gesture of silent support. This place, Rebecca gestured towards the shelter, is not you, Ethan. You built something bigger than this. Don't throw it all away for a charity project. It was at that moment that Clara appeared in the doorway. Mr. Carter. Lauren's asking if you're still going to help her with her resume today. Rebecca looked from Clara to Ethan, bitter understanding appearing in her eyes. Ah. Now I understand. No, Rebecca, you don't understand, Ethan said, his voice firm. And maybe you never will. Tell David he can try anything he wants. Some things are more important than power and money. He turned to go inside, then stopped. What about Rebecca? That Ethan you and David knew, the one who measured everything in dollars and cents. He was lost a long time ago. And honestly, I'm glad he got lost. Inside the shelter, Clara was waiting for him with a worried expression. Is everything all right? Ethan looked at Lucky, who had returned to his usual relaxed posture, then out into the corridor where he could see Lauren working on her borrowed laptop, determined to rebuild her life. You know, he said, for the first time in a long time, I think you really are. But as they walked back to the cafeteria, Ethan knew that Rebecca's visit was only the beginning. David was planning something, and the battle for the future of the shelter, and perhaps for his own redemption, was just beginning. The meeting room on the 47th floor of the Hartford Financial Center was silent, except for the soft sound of the air conditioning. 12 board members watched Ethan, their expressions ranging from skepticism to barely concealed hostility. David Reynolds was sitting at the opposite end of the table, a calculated smile on his face. As you can see, David concluded his presentation, projecting graphs onto the screen behind him. Mr. Carter's erratic behavior in recent weeks raises serious concerns about his leadership abilities. Cancellation of crucial meetings, questionable financial decisions, involvement with fringe elements of society. Ethan remained calm, observing the faces around him. People he had worked with for years now looked at him as a stranger. In his pocket, his phone vibrated, a message from Clara about the meeting with the shelter's new volunteers. Two worlds colliding. "If I may," Ethan finally spoke up, standing up, "I'd like to present a few different numbers." He connected his own laptop to the projector. On the screen, documents appeared that he had spent the last week preparing with the help of Frank, the veteran who, surprisingly, had a master's degree in data analysis. "Over the last 5 years, our company has invested millions in social responsibility marketing," Ethan began. "Expensive campaigns that generate headlines but little real impact. Now look at this." The figures changed, showing a detailed financial model. A corporate foundation focused on social rehabilitation and housing. Not just pretty words in annual reports, but real action. The return in terms of tax benefits and public goodwill would be 3 times greater than our current programs. "That's ridiculous," David interrupted, his mask of calm beginning to crack. "You want to turn one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast into a charity?" "No, David," Ethan replied calmly. "I want to turn it into something better. Something that makes a difference." "Difference?" David laughed, but there was a note of nervousness in his voice. "Like that little project of yours downtown? That pile of—" "Watch your next words," Ethan interrupted him, his voice taking on a tone that made several council members straighten up in their chairs. "Because what you're about to say could reveal a lot about your character." A tense silence fell over the room. David adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "The board can't ignore your recent behavior, Ethan. The missed meetings, the impulsive decisions." "Do you want to talk about impulsive decisions, David?" Ethan asked softly, plugging a USB stick into his laptop. "Like your decision to divert corporate funds to offshore accounts over the last 3 years?" David's face paled. "What are you talking about?" "Frank isn't just a veteran who helps out at the shelter," Ethan explained, new documents appearing on the screen. "He worked in financial intelligence in the Army. He has a special talent for finding hidden money." The board members leaned forward, their expressions changing from skepticism to intense interest as the numbers revealed themselves. 3 different accounts in the Cayman Islands," Ethan continued. "All traced back to phantom subsidiaries created in the last 18 months. Coincidentally, just after you took control of certain company operations." That's ridiculous," David stammered, but his face had lost all color. "These are baseless accusations from a clearly disturbed man." "The Justice Department doesn't seem to think so," Ethan replied, projecting one last document, an official notice of investigation. "They're particularly interested in your connections to certain financial institutions. Like Continental Bank, for example." The room erupted in murmurs. David stood up abruptly, his chair hitting the wall behind him. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to prove it," Ethan replied calmly. "The federal investigators will do that for me. Unless you resign now. Today. And transfer your shares to the new foundation I'm proposing." David looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only cold expressions. "You haven't changed a bit," he spat out the words. "You're still the same manipulator as ever." "No, David. I've changed. I've learned that there are better ways to use power and influence." Ethan paused, thinking of Lucky, of Clara, of all the people in the shelter. "And I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find something that really matters." 3 hours later, Ethan was leaving the Hartford Financial Center with a folder under his arm containing David's resignation and the first documents for the creation of the Hope Foundation. His phone rang. It was Clara. "How did it go?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Better than we expected," he replied, stopping on the sidewalk. Lucky, who was waiting for him in the car with his new driver, wagged his tail at the sight of him. The board approved the foundation. And David, well, let's just say he won't be a problem anymore. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Ethan," Clara finally said, "what exactly happened in that room?" He watched the people hurrying down the sidewalk, all focused on their own battles, their own journeys. "I learned something at the shelter, Clara. Sometimes, to do good, we need to be willing to fight with the same weapons as our opponents. The difference lies in what we do with the victory." "George used to say that there are no saints or villains," Clara replied softly. "Just people trying to find their way." Speaking of finding paths, Ethan smiled, getting into the car next to Lucky. "How about a coffee? I've got some ideas about how we can expand the shelter's vocational training program." As the car pulled away from the financial center, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. Maybe George was right, there were no saints or villains. Just people, with their wounds and their chances of redemption. And sometimes, all they needed was someone, or something, to show them the way home. The fall rain fell softly over Hartford, creating a gentle rhythm against the windows of the Hope Shelter. In the small office on the second floor, Clara was organizing a pile of documents while Ethan played distractedly with Lucky, who was lying lazily under the table. "I still can't believe Frank was an expert in financial intelligence," Clara commented, shaking her head. "All this time, he's never mentioned." "Some people carry their stories in silence," Ethan replied thoughtfully. "Like Lauren. Did you know she was a math teacher before?" His voice was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Frank appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Clara, Ethan, you need to see this." They followed Frank into the community room, where several residents were gathered around the small television. On the screen, a local reporter was standing in front of what looked like a family mansion. Following the shock resignation of David Reynolds from Carter and Reynolds Investments, new revelations emerge about his involvement in a real estate development scheme aimed at demolishing several community facilities, including the historic Hope Shelter. Clara gasped as she saw archive footage of the shelter. So it wasn't just about money? Was it personal? "It was always about power," Frank commented, his military training evident in his tense posture. "The shelter represents everything that people like Reynolds despise: compassion, community, second chances." Ethan watched the report in silence, memories of the last 18 months falling into place like pieces of a dark puzzle. The rigged bank rates, the sudden pressure, the impossible deadlines, all part of a bigger plan. "There's more," Frank continued, switching to his tablet. "I found connections between Reynolds and 3 other similar projects in different cities. The pattern is always the same: pressure community institutions until they go broke, buy the land for a fraction of the value, resell to developers." "What about the people?" Lauren asked from the doorway, Emma asleep in her arms. "What happens to people?" "They become statistics," Ethan replied bitterly, remembering how many times he himself had ignored the human cost of corporate decisions. "Numbers on a spreadsheet." Lucky approached Lauren, leaning gently against her leg as he did whenever he felt anxiety in the air. The simple gesture seemed to calm not only her, but everyone in the room. "But this time it's different," Clara said, her voice firm. "This time we have you, Ethan. And the foundation." Ethan was about to reply when his phone vibrated, a text message from an unknown number. As he read it, his face paled. "What is it?" Clara asked, noticing his expression. "It's from Rebecca," he replied, showing her the message. "David isn't alone in this. There are others, powerful people, who have an interest in seeing the shelter closed. She's warning me to be careful." "Why would she care?" Frank asked, his analyst instinct evidently activated. "Because," Ethan began slowly, a sudden realization hitting him, "she's discovered something. Something big enough to make her risk warning her ex-husband. Clara moved closer, putting a hand on his arm. Ethan, what exactly have we gotten ourselves into? Before he could answer, Lucky barked, a high-pitched, alert sound they'd never heard before. Seconds later, the lights in the shelter flickered on and off, leaving only the dim emergency lighting. This is no coincidence, Frank muttered, already moving to check the exits. Someone cut the main power. In the dark, Ethan felt Clara's hand squeeze his arm tighter. Through the fogged windows, shadows moved across the parking lot, dark figures converging on the building. Frank, Ethan called, his voice calm but urgent, take Lauren and Emma down to the basement. Clara, we need to gather all the important documents, now. And you? Clara asked, already moving towards the office. I need to make a call, he replied, picking up his phone. It's time to find out exactly how much Rebecca knows. Lucky positioned himself between Ethan and the door, his eyes shining in the dim light with an intensity reminiscent of the night of the storm. At that moment, Ethan understood that the real battle for the Hope Shelter was just beginning. And this time, it wasn't just about saving a building or an institution. It was about protecting a home, and the unlikely family he had found within it. The darkness in the Hope Shelter was broken only by the beams of light from the emergency lanterns and the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. A new storm was approaching Hartford, as if the sky itself was responding to the tension of the moment. Ethan, Clara and Frank were gathered in the office on the second floor, the lights of their flashlights creating dancing shadows on the walls. Lucky stood guard near the door, his ears alert for any suspicious movement. Rebecca's on her way, Ethan reported, hanging up the phone. She says she has documents, evidence of something much bigger than David or the bank. Can we trust her? Clara asked, her voice laden with concern. No, Ethan answered honestly. But right now, she's our best chance of understanding what's really going on. Frank consulted his tablet, which was still running on battery power. I've identified 3 suspicious vehicles on the perimeter. Professionals, by the way they position themselves. They're not just hired security guards, that's the work of specialists. A particularly loud clap of thunder rattled the windows. Downstairs, they could hear the shelter's residents moving around nervously, some already evacuated to the basement as per the emergency plan Frank had put in place. Hey, guys. Lauren appeared in the doorway, Emma still in her arms. There's a woman downstairs asking for you, Ethan. She says it's important. Rebecca was drenched by the rain when they found her in the foyer, her normally impeccable appearance in complete disarray. Her eyes were wide with something that looked very close to fear. You need to see this, she said flatly, handing Ethan a flash drive. That's why they're here. It's not just about the land or real estate development. The shelter, the location, is part of something much bigger. Frank quickly connected the drive to his tablet. Files began to open, blueprints, confidential documents, encrypted emails. My God, he muttered, his face paling as he read. That's. The sound of breaking glass on the second floor interrupted his sentence. Lucky immediately positioned himself in front of the group, growling low. They're inside, Frank warned, already in action mode. Rebecca, do you know who these people are? Not exactly, but I know they're dangerous. She looked at Ethan, her eyes full of guilt. David, he's involved with powerful people, Ethan. People who use urban development as a front for other operations. What kind of operations? Clara asked, although her tone suggested that she already suspected the answer. Money laundering, Rebecca replied. On a large scale. The safe house is located at a strategic point for. More sounds of invasion from the second floor. Frank quickly began transferring the files from the flash drive to a secure server. Clara, Ethan called out, his voice taking on a commanding tone that surprised everyone, including himself, take Rebecca and Lauren down to the basement with the others. Frank. Already on it, the the veteran replied, his fingers flying over the tablet. Sending everything to secure contacts. If anything happens to us, this information will go straight to the authorities. No, Clara protested. I'm not leaving you here. Someone needs to protect the residents, Ethan argued. And you're the only one they trust completely. A moment of understanding passed between them, something unspoken but perfectly understood. Clara nodded briefly, then turned to Rebecca and Lauren. Let's go. As soon as they left, Frank finished transferring the files. Done. Now we just need to. The office door burst inwards. 3 men in dark clothes burst into the room, their movements precise and professional. Lucky stepped forward, barking furiously. Mr. Carter, the leader of the group, spoke with an artificial calm. I believe you have something that belongs to us. Actually, Ethan replied, his voice surprisingly firm, I have several things that belong to you. Including evidence of a money laundering operation that stretches across 3 states. The man smiled, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. Then you know why we can't let you leave here with this information. Who says they're still here? Frank intervened, his tablet now dark in his hands. The leader's smile faltered. At the same moment, sirens began to sound in the distance, rapidly approaching. You're not the only ones with powerful connections, Ethan continued. And unlike you, my connections operate within the law. Lucky maintained his protective stance, his low growl echoing in the tension of the moment. Through the windows, the lights of police cars began to illuminate the parking lot. The leader of the group made a subtle gesture, and his men took a step back. This isn't over, Mr. Carter. You're right, Ethan replied. It's not over. But it's not going to end the way you planned either. When the police finally broke into the building minutes later, the men had disappeared, but they had left behind more than enough evidence of their invasion. More importantly, they had completely underestimated the determination of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. In the now cluttered room, Ethan knelt down next to Lucky, who was finally relaxing his defensive posture. You always knew, didn't you? Ever since that first night in the storm. You knew this was all going to happen. Lucky just tilted his head, his wise eyes reflecting the lights of the cars outside. And in that moment, as the rain continued to fall and the sirens echoed through the night, Ethan understood that some battles are worth more than just surviving, they're worth the complete transformation of who you are. The morning after the raid on the Hope shelter dawned with an almost ironic clarity. The autumn sun illuminated the shards of glass and scattered papers, transforming the chaos of the night before into a golden mosaic of destruction and resistance. Ethan was sitting on the steps of the shelter's entrance, Lucky lying faithfully next to him, as he watched the intense movement of police officers, federal agents, and journalists accumulating around the perimeter. Clara appeared with 2 cups of coffee, handing him one before sitting down. The investigators say that Rebecca's files are the tip of the iceberg, she commented, blowing on the surface of her coffee. Apparently, the money laundering scheme stretches up and down the East Coast. The safe house was just a small piece in a much bigger puzzle. Ethan nodded, his mind wandering back to the night he met Lucky on that dark road. Do you believe in fate, Clara? She looked at him curiously. Why? George Winters ran this place for 20 years. Lucky was by his side for 8 of those years. Every night, on every possible road he paused, stroking Lucky's head, he found me just when he needed to find me. A black car approached the shelter, and Rebecca got out of it, now impeccably dressed again, but with dark circles under her eyes that revealed a sleepless night. She walked towards them, stopping a few steps away. The federal prosecutors want my full testimony, she informed them. In exchange for partial immunity. David, he's being sought in 3 states now. Why did you decide to help us? Clara asked, her voice more curious than accusatory. Rebecca looked at the shelter, then at Ethan, her eyes softening slightly. Because when I saw Ethan here for the first time, I realized something I'd forgotten a long time ago. She paused. He seemed alive again. Not just existing, like in the last years of our marriage, but really alive. Lucky raised his head, studying Rebecca with those eyes that seemed to see through people. To everyone's surprise, he stood up and walked over to her, gently nuzzling her hand. George used to say that Lucky could see the best in people, Clara commented softly, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Rebecca swallowed, clearly moved by the dog's gesture. I need to go. I have a long session with the investigators ahead of me. She hesitated, then added, I'm sorry, Ethan. For everything. After she left, Frank appeared in the doorway, his tablet in hand as usual. I've got some news. Investigators have found connections between the scam and 3 members of the city council. And, he smiled slightly, the mayor just called. She wants to declare the Hope Shelter a city landmark. What does that mean for us? Clara asked. It means that no one will be able to demolish or significantly modify the building without special approval from the city, Ethan explained. The shelter is protected. A sound of applause and celebration emerged from inside the building. The residents and volunteers, who had gathered in the lobby, listened to the news with expressions of relief and joy. Lauren hugged Emma, silent tears streaming down her face. There's more, Frank continued. With the evidence we've collected, the Hope Foundation can requisition the assets seized from the money laundering scheme. We could expand the program to other neighborhoods, other cities. No, Ethan interrupted softly. Everyone looked at him in surprise. I mean, yes to expansion, but not with that kind of money. Let's do it the right way, with clean resources. This place, he gestured to the building behind them, deserves more than dirty money, even if it is for a good cause. Clara smiled, taking his hand. George would be proud to hear that. A group of children of some of the residents, ran past on the steps, laughing and playing with Lucky, who seemed perfectly in his element among them. The morning sun created a golden halo around them, turning an ordinary scene into something almost magical. You know what's funny? Ethan commented, observing the scene. For 18 months, I lived in a mansion that never felt like home. It only took a few weeks in this old, worn-out building for me to understand what it means to really belong somewhere. Frank consulted his tablet again. The structural engineers arrive in an hour to assess the damage from the break-in. And there's a cleaning crew on the way. No, Clara and Ethan said simultaneously. We'll clean it up ourselves, Clara continued. All together. That's how we've always done it here. As if to confirm her words, residents were already starting to show up with brooms, shovels and garbage bags. Lauren handed out rubber gloves. The veteran who always sat in his wheelchair near the entrance was organizing a team to pick up the shards of glass. A family, Ethan muttered, remembering the words he had heard so many times in recent weeks. That's what we are now. Lucky returned to his side, sitting between him and Clara as he had done so many times before. But now, looking at the dog, Ethan saw more than an animal rescued on a stormy night. He saw a guide, a guardian, someone who, in some inexplicable way, had known exactly how and when to lead him back into the light. The morning advanced, and with it, the sound of brooms, laughter and conversation filled the air. The Hope Shelter was bruised, but not broken. In fact, as its residents had proved so many times before, sometimes things need to break down completely in order to be rebuilt stronger than before. A month after the invasion, the Hope Shelter was unrecognizable. Not because of the destruction, but because of the transformation. The walls had been painted in vibrant colors chosen by the residents, the broken windows replaced with new glass that let in more light, and the old garden at the back was now home to a community garden. Ethan was in his old office in the corporate tower, packing the last of his things into a cardboard box. Lucky was resting by the glass door, watching the city below with his characteristic serenity. Mr. Carter, his assistant interrupted his thoughts. Ms. Morgan is here for the meeting about the foundation. Clara entered, carrying an old, battered briefcase. Her clothes were still simple, but there was a new confidence in her bearing, the confidence of someone who finally saw her dreams taking shape. "I found these this morning," she said, placing the folder on Ethan's desk. "It's George's diaries. Lauren was organizing the archive and, well, I think you need to see this." Ethan opened the folder carefully. Inside, as well as detailed notes about the shelter, were a series of photographs. In one of them, which appeared to have been taken over 20 years ago, a much younger George Winters was smiling next to a teenage boy in front of what looked like the Hope Shelter in its early days. "Turn the photo over," Clara suggested gently. On the back, a handwritten note read, "Ethan, 15 years old, first day in the youth program." So much determination in his eyes. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Ethan stared at the photograph, long-buried memories rising to the surface. An angry teenager from the Bronx, sent to a mentoring program in Hartford after trouble at school. A patient man who talked about second chances and transformation. "I didn't remember," he muttered, his voice breaking. "After I got the scholarship to college, after I met David, it was like that part of my life had been erased." Lucky moved closer, putting his head on her knee as he did whenever he felt her anguish. Clara took another leaf from the diary. "Sometimes, people need to lose themselves completely before they find their true way back home," she read. "And sometimes, we need to trust that the universe knows exactly when and how to bring them back." She paused. "George wrote that 3 days before he passed away." Ethan ran his fingers over the old photograph. He knew. All this time, Lucky knew, it wasn't a coincidence. "George believed that there are no coincidences," Clara smiled. "Just moments waiting to happen." The phone on the table rang. It was Frank, from the shelter. "You need to come back here," he said, his voice animated. "Lauren just got the job at the school. And the job training program, we have a waiting list of companies wanting to take part." As he carefully put the photo and diary away in his box, Ethan noticed something else in the folder, an envelope addressed to him, in George's handwriting. "To be delivered when you find your way back," Clara read the inscription on the front. With slightly trembling hands, Ethan opened the envelope. "Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, it means that Lucky has fulfilled his mission. He has always had a special gift for guiding lost people back home. When you first came to the shelter all those years ago, I saw in your eyes the same thing I see in everyone who walks through our doors, a light waiting to be rediscovered. You found your way once, but sometimes life has a funny way of making us turn around before we get to where we really need to be. The shelter has always been more than a building, it's a testament to the fact that everyone deserves a second chance. Or, in your case, perhaps a third. Don't blame yourself for forgetting. Sometimes we need to get lost in the shadows to really appreciate the light when we find it again. Lucky is yours now, just as the shelter has always been your home, even when you didn't know it. Take care of them, and let them take care of you." With hope and faith, George, a solitary tear fell onto the letter. Ethan looked out of his office window, the same office that once represented everything he thought he wanted in life. Now, it seemed only a temporary stop on a much longer journey. "Ready to go home?" Clara asked softly. Lucky was already at the door, his tail wagging as if he understood the moment perfectly. Ethan picked up the box with his last belongings, including the photo and the letter, bridges between his past and his future. "Yes," he replied, a genuine smile forming on his face. "I'm ready to go home." As they left the corporate building for the last time, Ethan understood that some journeys are not about reaching a destination, but about returning to the starting point with fresh eyes. And sometimes, you need a four-legged guardian angel to show you the way. A year has passed since the night of the storm. The shelter of hope, now expanded and renovated, shone under the autumn sun. In the back garden, where once there had been nothing but wasteland, dozens of people gathered for a special celebration. Lauren, wearing a professional suit that perfectly matched her new position as a teacher, stood on the small makeshift stage, Emma holding her hand as she spoke. When I arrived here 18 months ago, I had only a backpack, a small daughter, and a lot of fear. Today, she paused, moved, today I'm a teacher again, I have my own apartment, and most importantly, I have a family. A family that I chose, and that chose me back. Ethan watched the scene from the back of the garden, Lucky faithfully by his side. Clara moved closer, entwining her fingers in his, a gesture that had become natural in recent months. I thought you'd be more nervous, she commented. It's not every day that you inaugurate a national network of shelters. The Hope Foundation had grown beyond the most optimistic expectations. The shelter model was being replicated in 5 states, each unit maintaining George's original philosophy, not just offering a roof over one's head, but a real chance for a fresh start. You know what's funny? Ethan replied, watching Frank, now the Foundation's Director of Operations, organizing the new volunteers. A year ago, I measured success in dollars and cents. Now, he gestured to the diverse crowd in the garden, now I measure it in smiles, in stories of overcoming. The veteran in the wheelchair, who now coordinated the psychological support program, walked past them, carrying an old box. We found more photos of George, he announced. They're going to be part of the permanent exhibition in the lobby. Lucky barked softly, as if approving of the idea. Over the last few months, he had become a kind of official mascot not only of the original shelter, but of the entire program. His picture, next to George, took pride of place in every new unit that opened. Rebecca appeared at the celebration, more discreet now, but with a serenity she hadn't possessed before. After her testimony, she had dedicated herself to working with women who were victims of abusive relationships, finding her own form of redemption. David was sentenced this morning, she reported quietly. 15 years. The judge was particularly harsh because of the social impact of the scheme. Ethan nodded, but his attention was on a different scene, a teenager newly arrived at the shelter, with challenging eyes that were so reminiscent of his own so many years ago. Hey, he called out to the boy. Do you want to meet someone special? Lucky, as if understanding his cue, gently approached the teenager. The boy, initially hesitant, didn't resist when the dog leaned his head on his hand. What's your name? Clara asked. Marcus, the boy replied, a small smile forming as he stroked Lucky. Marcus Winters. Ethan and Clara exchanged a surprised look. Winters. George was my uncle, the boy explained. I hadn't seen him for years, but when I heard what happened here, about how his place was helping people, I thought maybe. You've come to the right place, Ethan smiled, recognizing in the boy's eyes the same sparkle George had seen in his so many years ago. The celebration continued as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Residents old and new, volunteers, staff, all united not only by their stories of overcoming, but by the certainty that they belonged there. On the small stage, Clara was now talking about the Foundation's future plans. Ethan watched her proudly, remembering his first impression of her, the suspicious director who saw him as just another rich guy trying to clear his conscience. Lucky leaned against his leg, catching his eye. Together, they walked to George's memorial, a simple bronze plaque with his photo and one of his favorite sayings, "Hope is not just a name, it's a promise." You knew all along, didn't you? Ethan murmured to Lucky. Ever since that first night in the storm. You knew I was that boy in the picture, you knew I had to come back. The dog just tilted his head, his wise eyes reflecting the last lights of the day. In the garden, Marcus had joined a group of teenagers from the youth program, his face more relaxed, more open. Some stories don't end, Clara said, coming up behind him. They just start again, in different ways. Ethan pulled her close, Lucky sitting contentedly at his feet. Around them, the garden was full of laughter, conversation and that special kind of warmth that only exists when people find their true place in the world. Do you know what George wrote at the end of that last diary? Clara asked softly. The greatest miracle isn't changing the world, it's changing a life. And sometimes, when we change one life, we find that that life changes others, who change others, until, without realizing it, we change the world anyway. In the sky, the first stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere in the distance, a new storm was brewing, but this time, no one at Shelter Hope feared the rain. After all, sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as storms, guided by four-legged angels who know exactly where and when to find us. And so the circle came full circle, not an end, but a new beginning. Because some stories, like the hope that inspires them, never really end. They just continue, transforming lives, one at a time.